Hello. Today we will be presenting about learning from failure, and this is an analysis of the Turkana fish processing plant in Kenya.
One of your presenters today is Marwah. I'm a mechanical engineering student.
And I'm Alejandro, and I'm also studying mechanical engineering.
So why do engineers even fail? And why are we talking about failure? Classes only teach about calculated qualitative decisions, and a lot of the times we miss out on how to interact with complex communities, sociocultural differences, unfamiliar governmental structures, and we forget how to incorporate our engineering design with those aspects. In 2007, the International Finance Corporation released information that half of its aid-funded projects in Africa were failing. So we need to figure out what's going on.
The Turkana people. So who are they? The Turkana people are a nomadic group that live in northwest Kenya, and they mainly herd cattle, camels, donkeys, goats, and sheep. However, they have also been vulnerable to famine historically. So when a drought comes, they must slaughter all of their animals to survive, and then afterwards, because they have eaten their animals, there is no more food left.
So an overview of the Turkana plant project. In 1967, Kenya asked Norway to help develop the fisheries of Lake Turkana in order to help the Turkana people sustain a different food source. And one of the goals was to promote fishing since historically the Turkana never fished. In 1970, the project started. Norway was providing financial and technical help. And in the first years, they created the National Turkana Fisheries Cooperative Society. And that was when, in 1974, one of the Norwegian consultants recommended that they build a fish plant at Lake Turkana to freeze fish and to process it. And Kenya took the advice and they asked Norway for help. The goal was to provide better fish and then employment and food to the Turkana people. So in 1978, they signed the agreement and Norway bought boats and fishing tools to teach the Turkana people how to fish. And it was in 1981 when the project was completed.
So this isn't a complicated situation because there have been multiple perspectives and multiple sides involved in this, in trying to solve this problem. So the first perspective is from the Norwegian government, is that the Turkana needed food and the fish plant didn't force anything on the people. So in their view, this was a philanthropic effort. There was also the community perspective, which was that fish for the community, they hadn't historically relied on it, and for them it was also associated with snakes, and salt on fish especially was a taboo. So that was one perspective. And another perspective from the Kenyan government was that the Turkana people would often raid their neighbors to maintain the cattle and the animals as a food source. So for the administration, less raids meant that animals. Uh, so for the administration, having this fish processing plant meant that the Turkana people would have less raids. So the general takeaway from this is that many different parties approaching this problem had different solutions. And when we're trying to solve these solutions, we have to be aware of all of these different biases.
So one of the examples for the Harvard chapter is we had a community project with Mukatani, and when we were talking, for instance, to the headmaster for the school about what the next priority project would be, from his perspective, he really advocated for more teachers' housing, whereas what we knew was and what we saw from the community, they didn't express that much interest or urgency with the teachers' housing. So that's just one example in which when you're talking, for instance, to a figure of authority or someone who's working with a specific institution, for instance, the headmaster is working with the school, there are different incentives and sometimes unconscious biases that we see. So for instance, for the headmaster, he may have wanted to display an image of productivity for his schools so that could skew a bit the perspective on what's really needed.
And for the Los Angeles project, something that we have to take into consideration is that when we were designing our water distribution system, we were modeling it using American design standards. So for these, there was a certain range of acceptable water pressures. However, higher water pressures could have actually been okay for the community we were working with, since many of their homes had their own individual water tanks.
So one of the issues that the Turkana project dealt with, and ultimately one of the issues that caused it to fail, was a failure to properly assess the needs of the community that they were addressing and the project.
So who did the NORAD consult? So the NORAD was a Norwegian Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. So this was the main Norwegian group that was working on the project. And they consulted the Kenyan Government Reference Group. They also consulted people in Turkana, but they did not directly consult communities. They instead consulted TFCS, the Turkana Fisheries Cooperative Society, and other fisheries in the area. So although they talked to the fisheries cooperative, they never reached out directly to the Turkana people. And they also consulted other members within their own organization. So they worked with the community for 10 years. However, maybe because they did not directly talk to the Turkana people, they might have assumed what some of their needs were.
One of the issues too that the NORAD advisory report we saw in it. The NORAD advisory report was a report written before the completion of the project by the Norwegian agency to assess the project and to provide advice. And it was interesting that this quote, was brought up, that most Turkana people are not going to be able to afford or to pay for the fish. So they're losing sight of who the project is really intended for. The initial goal from all of this was to provide a food source for the Turkana people. And while economics and other financial advantages might have been a bonus or a good add-on or an extra advantage, the main focus was supposed to be the food source for the Turkana, not economics. And you can tell from the language as the advisory report develops that it slowly shifts from focusing on the food source to what kind of economic incentives exist. So if the Turkana can't afford the expensive fresh fish, the initial issue still exists. So even though it may be marketable in nearby urban centers, that started taking importance over accessibility to actual Turkana people.
Another point is that the way the NORAD approached this was that they were trying to convince people to change their way of living. So again, they were losing sight of what the people originally needed. Instead of focusing on providing them a viable food source, they were focusing on how they could change the way people lived. So even if dried fish is transported to remote areas, one thing then they didn't quite consider was that it might not be purchased. First, because maize was much cheaper than the fish, and also because meat is considered superior and the people were more used to meat.
So one of the things that we want to bring back a little bit is how can EWB chapters and EWB students make sure that we're properly focusing on the needs that we intended to address. So again, going back to the Mukatani example, we've been having issues with ensuring the community's adequate maintenance of systems, and this is particularly because funding that was intended for maintenance gets reallocated for other issues that they believe are of more importance. So one idea that we had was to write a contract to bind them to the maintenance. But written contracts in the community aren't really used or regarded at the same level of binding or as importance in the U.S. And it also may come off as a bit hostile. So another suggestion was try to convince them of the importance of maintenance through more trainings. But so if we force them to sign contracts, which they never use, or to undergo more intense training that tries to teach them to change their priorities, so to save funding for maintenance rather than to use it for the next immediate concern, then we can't expect that to instantaneously solve the issue because we're trying to mold their priorities and their own traditions rather than find a solution that is compatible with what they already believe and how they choose to prioritize projects.
And for the Los Angeles project, we are currently planning on going on an assessment trip. And although we already have a general idea of what the community might need, and in this case we were thinking about a water distribution system, this might not actually be their most urgent and important need. They might have a greater need for creating, for example, a reliable and suitable water source and bringing in the water from that source. So our team must go in with an open mind, and we must be open to other suggestions than the community has, and not present ourselves as only willing to work on one single project, a distribution project. And there's also a humanitarian responsibility involved in this. So we need to try our best on finding solutions that are compatible with the traditions and beliefs. So even if you don't agree with them, rather than trying to convince or to change the people's beliefs. So if you find yourself using the word convince, then maybe you should reconsider your approach.
So one of the other issues that the Turkana project failed because of is a failure to properly understand culture.
One important point was the salt taboo. So the project, the people who were organizing this and the Norwegian consultants, they knew about this. They knew that salt, especially salted fish, was a taboo for the Turkana people. However, they still tried to convince them to change. And they did not properly accept or respect the cultural differences. And also, the Turkana people had no actual history of eating fish or fishing. So because one point in this cause was because new fishermen didn't have livestock, they couldn't marry because it was customary to give the bride's family 60 goats.
And then another issue was the type of studies that were conducted in the attempt to assess the project. Kenya and Norway governments collaborated, but they exclusively conducted economic studies to assess the finances and the economics, but they didn't do any direct cultural or social studies or surveys with the Turkana people. So throughout this entire process, there was hardly any communication with the common Turkana people.
So for these projects, one important point is that we need to accept the culture of the people we are working with. And it's important to recognize that some cultural traditions are not things that have to be fixed. So this is similar to focusing on need. We must find solutions within what works for the people.
So, how can EWB chapters better understand culture? Overall, listening to everyone and trying to account for people's biases and incentives. So, being aware of the possible motivations that different people have, not necessarily bad motivations, but just if you're talking to a government official versus if you're talking to a school teacher, how are their perspectives and how are their desires going to differ, and how does that change how you approach the project? And then also communicating with the local government directly, not just the government. So questions you can ask are, for instance, how is the community organized? How are relations between the home country and the project site? How do those shape the relationships and the attitudes between you and the people from the country? Also, how did the project begin? Who initiated it? Who was included and excluded from that initiation process, and why? Whose concerns and interests also does the project represent? Does it protect that individual? Does it harm them? And who stands to gain from the project? More importantly, and one of the questions that I think is a bit underrated, is who is accountable for the project's success? Because based on who is accountable, you can often have a better understanding of how this affects different people and how that accountability is going to affect the efficacy of the project. Also, to what extent do community development projects give priority to students' learnings and their international exposure? So making students more competitive to the job market, and also their philanthropic image of sponsoring universities over the long-term risks and costs to the community. So when we're looking at these projects, we want to make sure that we are doing projects and we're working within communities and we're prioritizing the projects that are actually going to be the best for the community rather than the projects that are going to make our resumes look better.
Yeah, and one point for the Los Angeles project has been brought up multiple times, but I think it's still valuable to talk about is the relationship between the local Dominican communities and the Haitian communities. And because the Haitians are also migrant workers and the communities aren't as established as the Dominican ones, it's sometimes difficult to directly work with the Haitian communities. But this doesn't mean that we should ignore them or overlook their needs. An effort must still be made to help connect the Dominican communities with the Haitian communities and to address both of their needs.
One other issue that the Turkana project faced is a failure to properly apply knowledge. So, for instance, there was limited electricity in the project. There was extremely hot weather, so it was extremely expensive to freeze the fish and to keep the cool temperatures in the facility. And as mentioned before, this caused the fish to be even more unaffordable to the Turkana people. Actually, it was so much energy required to run the plant that it was more energy than the actual community could produce. Additionally, the Lake Turkana, in which 80%, or in which a majority of the fishing was happening, actually has a history of disappearing every 30 years, and that possibility of failure wasn't considered. So severe droughts and weather changes every 30 years causes 30% of the lake to disappear, which causes 80% of the fishing to no longer be accessible. So 20,000 Turkana people who had been trained and, in some ways readjusted their lifestyles to fish were left without a food source when the drought hit because now they didn't have livestock and they didn't have access to fishing.
So in terms of humanitarian responsibility, we have to directly ask the people themselves. We have to talk to the communities. So communication with communities is key to understanding the nuances of all of these different circumstances and the different needs than like outside groups can actually help with.
And then another Mukatani example is that the community is really enthusiastic about all the projects that they can get, so they'll almost never say no to a project. And as a result, sometimes they take on too many projects at a time, and the resources and time invested into previous projects is strained in a way that makes them ineffective or unsustained. So applying knowledge would be knowing that even though the community would agree to another project, it's probably at its capacity right now, and it would ultimately negatively affect other projects.
So finally, although this project in the general sense was a failure, there were still a few unexpected outcomes. So of the $22 million that was spent on this project, only $2 million of them were spent directly on the plant. The other $20 million were actually spent on roads connecting the plant to Kenya's road system and to other major cities like Nairobi. So although the plant quickly shut down, the roads were still there, and in some ways this was a big benefit to their local infrastructure.
Yes. Ultimately, this project may seem like a much larger scope and scale than a lot of the EWB projects that we work on, and that's true. But what we can do is we can extract a lot of the ways in which this project failed and a lot of the patterns and nuanced mistakes that they made and apply that to our own specific EWB projects. And one of the most important points that we've been making is to try our best to have a deep cultural understanding of the community and to respect those differences even if we don't truly understand them. And it's hard to do that since EWB chapters, usually we spend very little time in the community. So we don't have the time or the resources to be there long enough to create these and establish these relationships. But nonetheless, the things that we can do are ask the questions that we mentioned previously in this presentation and to just have a higher awareness of the impact that we're making and who it's affecting. So as long as we're trying to be cautious and more aware of how we approach each problem and focusing and having explicitly stated our needs and our goals and our focus, that can help us just be a little bit better at properly addressing the issues.
This is the end of our presentation. Here are the sources that we used. One of the most important sources that we used is source number 4, Aid to Fisheries in Lake Turkana by the NORAD. This was a report created directly by the Norwegian aid organization before the completion of the project. So it gives the reader a glimpse into what the thought processes of the Norwegian government was that led up to the project and their goals for the project.
Yep, and these are just a few additional sources, and that's all we have for today. Thanks.